Secrecy is the currency of the underworld, but arrogance is its downfall. Sitting in the mahogany-paneled war room of the Parker estate, the sharpest minds in the New York syndicate stared blindly at a string of alphanumeric garbage on the projector. They thought they were facing an impenetrable digital fortress. They didn't know the woman quietly refilling their espresso cups, a nameless girl in a starched apron, had already broken the encryption before she even finished pouring the cream. Sunlight angled sharply through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Parker estate, illuminating the floating motes of airborne lint that Charlie Dawson was paid to eradicate. Situated on a secluded, heavily guarded peninsula in the Hamptons, the sprawling modern fortress was a monument to immense wealth and unspoken violence. For 6 months Charlie had existed within these walls not as a person, but as a piece of mobile furniture. She was the maid, the girl who polished the imported Carrara marble countertops, who meticulously aligned the Lalique crystal decanters in the study, and who scrubbed the intricate grooves of the antique Persian rugs until her knuckles turned raw. Invisibility was her greatest asset. Back in Chicago, Charlie had been a promising cryptology and applied mathematics doctoral candidate at Northwestern University. Her world had consisted of prime numbers, algorithms, and the quiet sanctuary of the university library. That was before her father, Arthur, a brilliant but hopelessly addicted gambler, had borrowed $500,000 from the outfit to fund a guaranteed stock tip that crashed overnight. When the collectors came, Arthur vanished. The debt, by the brutal laws of the underworld, transferred to his only living relative. Charlie had come home to a ransacked apartment and a polite, terrifying voicemail giving her 1 week to pay. Survival dictated immediate flight. She abandoned her degree, her identity, and her future, boarding a Greyhound bus eastward with nothing but $300 and a forged reference letter. The cash-only domestic staff position at the Parker estate was supposed to be a temporary hideout, a place so deeply entrenched in the shadows that the Chicago mobs would never dare cross into its jurisdiction. Working for the Parker family required a deliberate suppression of the senses. You did not look at the men who arrived in armored Maybachs. You did not listen to the muffled arguments echoing from the soundproofed billiard room. You certainly did not ask questions when asked to bleach a perfectly good silk rug at 3 in the morning. Duran Parker demanded absolute perfection. Taking the reins of the syndicate after his father succumbed to a sudden, highly suspicious heart attack, Durand had aggressively modernized the family's operations. At 32, he was a terrifying hybrid of old-world ruthlessness and Silicon Valley efficiency. Tall, broad-shouldered, and possessing a gaze that felt like a physical weight, Durand moved through his estate like a dark sovereign. His bespoke Brioni suits never wrinkled. His voice rarely rose above a calm, measured baritone, which only made him more intimidating. When Durand entered the room, the temperature seemed to drop. The guards stood straighter, the capos stopped breathing, and the domestic staff practically melted into the plaster. Charlie observed him with the detached, analytical eye of a scientist studying a volatile element. She noted the way he favored his left leg slightly when it grained a souvenir from a survived assassination attempt 2 years prior. She recognized the subtle tightening of his jaw when his underboss Leo Rossi reported lower than expected yields from the shipping ports in Red Hook. Charlie saw everything, cataloging the intricate dynamics of the Mafia hierarchy while quietly polishing the banisters. Tension had been suffocating the house for the past 3 weeks. A brutal turf war was brewing. The Volkov Syndicate, a deeply entrenched and brutally violent Russian faction operating out of Brighton Beach, had begun testing the borders of Durand's territory. Nikolai Volkov, a man known for skinning informants alive, was aggressively expanding his narcotics and weapons smuggling operations. directly interfering with the Parker family's long-standing control over the Eastern Seaboard logistics network. The atmosphere in the mansion reached a boiling point on a humid Tuesday afternoon. Black SUVs lined the circular driveway. Men with broad chests and heavily tattooed hands paced the manicured lawns, chain-smoking and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Inside, the grand dining room had been converted into a war room. Charlie stood in the adjoining butler's pantry, staring at the polished silver tray resting on the granite counter. 6 glasses of San Pellegrino, 3 double espressos, and 1 glass of Macallan 25-year scotch. Her supervisor, a stern woman named Beatrice who ruled the staff with an iron fist, practically shoved the tray into Charlie's hands. "In and out, Charlie," Beatrice hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward the heavy oak doors of the dining room. "Do not make eye contact. Do not linger. Pour the water, set the coffee, and vanish. Mr. Parker is in a foul mood today." Nodding silently, Charlie adjusted the stiff collar of her gray uniform. She took a deep breath, perfectly balancing the heavy silver tray, and pushed through the swinging doors into the lion's den. The air inside the room was thick with tension, smelling of expensive cologne, roasted coffee beans, and raw fear. Walking into the war room required a performance of utter insignificance. Charlie kept her eyes downcast, focusing entirely on the rim of the tray and the polished oak floorboards. At the head of the massive table sat Durand Parker, his dark hair impeccably styled, his expression carved from granite. He was gently turning a heavy silver lighter over and over in his long, calloused fingers. The metallic plink-clink was the only sound cutting through the heavy silence. Flanking him were his top lieutenants, Darren Giordano, a massive enforcer with a scar dissecting his left eyebrow, and Leo Rossi, the smooth-talking underboss who currently looked like he was suffering from a migraine. At the far end of the table, pacing nervously in front of a massive smartboard monitor, was Gregory, the syndicate's chief cybersecurity expert. Gregory was sweating profusely, the damp patches spreading under the arms of his expensive dress shirt. "I need you to understand, boss," Gregory stammered, frantically wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "This isn't standard encryption. It's not a simple PGP key or an RSA token. The Volkovs have hired someone completely off the grid. This is military-grade, custom-built cryptography." Durand stopped turning the lighter. The silence that followed was physically oppressive. Charlie silently approached the table, moving like a ghost. She set the glass of Macallan near Durand's right hand, careful not to let the crystal clink against the wood. "They hijacked $30 million worth of untraceable bearer bonds, Gregory," Durand said, his voice a lethal, quiet purr. "They slaughtered 4 of my best men at the docks. And instead of fencing the bonds, Nikolai sends a digital file to my personal server. A file you are telling me you cannot open. I can open the file, Mr. Parker." Gregory swallowed hard. "It's the text inside. It's a cipher. A taunt. I've run it through 3 separate brute force algorithmic decryptors. We've tried frequency analysis, dictionary attacks, everything. It just outputs more garbage." Charlie moved around the table, pouring the sparkling water for Darren. Out of pure, ingrained curiosity, her eyes flicked upward toward the glowing 70-inch smartboard. The screen was filled with lines of chaotic text. It looked like a random assortment of alphanumeric characters interspersed with Cyrillic letters and bizarre spacing. X7VQP. 9L. 4EMR. Most people would see static. Charlie's brain, however, was hardwired for pattern recognition. Even as she poured the espresso for Leo, her mind involuntarily locked onto the screen. It wasn't random. True randomness in computing is incredibly difficult to achieve. Algorithms always leave a fingerprint. She noticed the grouping. The text was formatted in blocks of 5 characters. That was a classic hallmark of radio transmission ciphers, designed to prevent telegraph operators from guessing words based on length. But there was a secondary layer. The Cyrillic characters weren't part of the alphabet being used. They were markers. Spacers. Charlie shifted to the next chair. It's a polyalphabetic substitution, she thought, her pulse quickening slightly. A Vigenère cipher, but they're using the Cyrillic characters as rotational shift indicators. Every time a Cyrillic letter appears, the alphabet matrix shifts based on its numerical position in the Russian alphabet. It was clever, but it was mathematically flawed. The creator had relied on the complexity of the secondary shift to hide the primary weakness of the Vigenère cipher, repeated sequences. Charlie's eyes darted across the 3rd paragraph. There it was. The sequence 7VQP repeated exactly 42 characters later. The key length was a factor of 42, 6 or 7. So, you're telling me, Duran's voice snapped Charlie back to reality, that the Volkovs are sitting on my money, taunting me with the location of their next strike, and my multi-million-dollar tech division is beaten by a word puzzle? I need more time, boss, Gregory pleaded. A week. Maybe less if I can outsource some processing power to a server farm in Iceland. Al. You have until midnight, Duran replied coldly, picking up the glass of Macallan. If that screen isn't legible by the time the clock strikes 12, I am going to have Darren break your hands. You won't be typing anything ever again. Charlie finished her rounds, placed her tray against her hip, and backed out of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. The rest of the day was a blur of mindless physical labor. Charlie polished silver, vacuumed the guest wing, and sorted the dry cleaning. But her mind was miles away, trapped in the glowing white text of the smartboard. The mathematical puzzle gnawed at her. It was an itch she desperately needed to scratch. She missed the thrill of deciphering, the beautiful, elegant moment when chaos collapsed into order. By 1 in the morning, the mansion had finally descended into an uneasy silence. The war room had been abandoned, the men having relocated to the basement shooting range to blow off steam, leaving the remnants of their frustration behind. Charlie's shift had ended hours ago, but sleep was impossible. Dressed in her simple cotton pajamas and a worn, oversized cardigan, she crept out of her servants' quarters. The hallways were dim, illuminated only by the soft amber glow of security sconces. She moved soundlessly, avoiding the floorboards she knew creaked near the east corridor. She slipped into the war room. It smelled strongly of stale tobacco and anxiety. The massive smartboard was still powered on, casting an eerie, pale blue light across the long mahogany table. Gregory had left his laptop connected, a decryption program still running futile loops on the screen. Charlie approached the board. She pulled a discarded paper napkin from a side table and picked up a silver Mont Blanc pen that someone had abandoned near the coffee cups. She looked at the text. Key length of 7, she hypothesized. Let's assume the key is related to the Volkovs. Nikolai. Nikola. 7 letters. She started writing on the napkin. She took the first block of encrypted text. Applying the inverse shift of the word Nikolai, she subtracted the alphabetical values. Then she factored in the Cyrillic markers, shifting the matrix back accordingly. Her pen flew across the textured paper of the napkin. Mathematics wasn't just numbers. It was a language, and Charlie was fluent. The rigid, confusing strings of data began to soften, yielding to the logic of her calculations. The first word emerged. Shipment. Then the second. Redirected. Charlie's breath hitched. She was translating the syndicate's deepest secrets on a cocktail napkin. She continued, entirely consumed by the flow state of the decryption. The full first sentence materialized under her pen, Shipman redirected to Pier 44. Warehouse 9. The lion sleeps while the beer eats. Leuven Asta 300 hours tomorrow. It wasn't just a taunt. It was a logistical ledger. The Volkovs were moving the bearer bonds and a new shipment of weaponry through Pier 44, mocking Durand by telling him exactly where it would be, confident he could never read it. Suddenly, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed in the marble hallway outside the room. Charlie froze. The spell was broken. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. If she was caught in here meddling with syndicate intelligence, they wouldn't just fire her. They would assume she was a spy. They would bury her in the Foundation. She dropped the pen, spun around, and practically dove toward the concealed servants' exit behind the heavy velvet curtains. She slipped through the hidden door just as the main brass handle of the war room turned, clicking shut the panel behind her, her heart threatening to crack her ribs. Durand Parker did not sleep. Sleep was a vulnerability, a state of unconsciousness where enemies could plot and empires could crumble. He walked into the war room at 1:15 a.m., a fresh tumbler of bourbon in his hand, his tie loosened around his collar. He intended to stare at the screen until the numbers either made sense or he decided to execute Gregory. He flipped the light switch. The overhead chandeliers flared to life, banishing the blue glow of the monitor. Durand walked slowly toward the head of the table, his eyes fixed on the maddening cipher. Then he saw it, sitting perfectly centered on the dark, polished mahogany. Directly beneath the smartboard was a white cocktail napkin. Beside it lay his silver Mont Blanc pen. Durand's brow furrowed. His security was absolute. Nobody entered this room without his explicit permission. He set his bourbon down and picked up the napkin. The handwriting was small, elegant, and hurried. Beneath a series of complex mathematical notations, matrix grids, and Cyrillic translations, a clear, plain English sentence was written out in black ink. Shipman redirected to Pier 44, waitresses 9. The LIMN sleeps while the beer eats. Movement to 0300 hours tomorrow. Durand stopped breathing. He stared at the napkin, then looked up at the screen. The translation matched the exact length and structure of the first paragraph perfectly. The code was broken. His first instinct was not relief, it was intense, blinding suspicion. Someone had been in this room. Someone had bypassed Gregory's multi-million-dollar software with a pen and a piece of paper. If someone could sneak in and decipher a military-grade code, they could just as easily plant a bug or poison his drink. He pulled his phone from his pocket and hit a speed dial number. Darren. War room. Now. Less than 60 seconds later, the heavy doors opened. Darren stepped in, his massive frame filling the doorway, an unsuppressed Heckler & Koch pistol already drawn and resting against his thigh. Boss? We under attack. Are you? Someone was in here, Durand said softly, holding up the napkin. They solved the Volkov cipher. Darren blinked, looking around the empty room. Gregory? If Gregory could solve this, he wouldn't be sweating through his shirt 10 hours ago, Durand countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. This was done by hand, recently. The ink is barely dry. Durand moved swiftly to the corner of the room, accessing the hidden keypad behind a framed oil painting. He punched in a code revealing a sleek security terminal. He pulled up the closed-circuit television feeds for the interior of the house. Pull the logs for the hallway, Durand commanded, his eyes scanning the monitors. Durand leaned over his shoulder. Nobody came through the main doors, boss. The guards have been posted at the east and west wings since dinner. Durand rewound the footage of the war room itself. The camera was discreetly mounted in the eye of a carved wooden eagle on the bookcase. He watched the digital clock on the screen spin backward. 1:10 a.m. 1:10:05 a.m. 1 a.m. At 12:48 a.m., the footage showed a slight movement near the heavy velvet curtains. The concealed servant's door opened. Durand paused the video. He zoomed in. A figure stepped into the room. It wasn't an assassin in tactical gear. It wasn't a Volkov spy. It was a young woman in an oversized frayed cardigan and cotton pajamas. Her hair, usually scraped back into a severe bun, was falling loosely around her shoulders. Durand watched in stunned silence as the maid struggled to recall her name. Chloe. Charlie walked confidently up to the smartboard. He watched her pull the napkin, uncap the pen, and stare at the screen. For 20 minutes she didn't move her eyes from the data, her hand working furiously over the paper. "Is that the cleaning girl?" Darren asked, his rough voice laced with profound confusion. "The quiet one." Durand didn't answer. He watched the footage as Charlie suddenly froze, head turning toward the hallway, before sprinting back to the servants' passage, disappearing mere seconds before Durand himself had walked into the room. A complex storm of emotions raged behind Durand's dark eyes. Anger, paranoia, and a sharp, sudden spike of intense fascination. A domestic servant earning $20 an hour off the books had just effortlessly dismantled a cryptographic wall that had bested his entire cyber division. "Who hired her?" Durand demanded quietly. "Beatrice. About 6 months ago. Background check came back clean, boss. Small-town girl, no criminal record, no connections to any rival families. She just needed cash work. Background checks can be forged," Durand stated, his tone absolute. "Nobody who scrubs toilets for a living can calculate polyalphabetic matrices in their head. Bring her to my study, now. Do not make a scene, but do not give her a choice." "Ah." Charlie was sitting on the edge of her narrow twin bed, her knees pulled up to her chest, shivering despite the heavy quilt. She had been staring at the wall for 20 minutes, listening to the heavy silence of the house, waiting for the inevitable alarm. When the heavy rhythmic knock came at her modest wooden door, she closed her eyes. "It's over." She stood up, smoothing down her pajamas, and opened the door. Durand stood in the narrow hallway, his massive frame completely blocking the exit. He looked completely out of place in the sterile utilitarian servants' quarters. "Mr. Parker wants to see you," Durand said. It wasn't a request. Charlie nodded slowly, her throat too dry to speak. She didn't bother grabbing a robe. She followed Durand through the labyrinthine corridors, moving from the drab-gray walls of the staff area back into the opulent, terrifying world of the main house. They arrived at Durand's private study, a room even the senior staff were rarely allowed to enter. It was lined with rare books, smelling of expensive leather and cedar. Durand was standing behind his massive oak desk. He wasn't looking at her when she entered. He was looking at the napkin, which he had carefully placed under the glow of a brass reading lamp. Durand stepped out, closing the heavy oak doors with a decisive, echoing thud. Charlie was trapped. Durand finally looked up. His dark eyes locked onto hers, stripping away her invisibility in a single, piercing glance. Charlie forced herself to stand tall, refusing to let her hands shake, though her heart was violently assaulting her rib cage. "Charlie Dawson," Durand said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He pronounced her name slowly, as if tasting it. "At least, that's the name on your employment file." "That is my name, sir," Charlie managed to say, her voice miraculously steady. Durand picked up the napkin. He walked slowly around the desk, closing the distance between them. He towered over her, radiating a dangerous, quiet heat. "I have a cyber division that costs me $2 million a year," Durand said, stopping just inches from her. "They told me this code was military grade. They told me it would take a server farm in Iceland a week to crack it." He held the napkin up. You did it in 20 minutes, on a cocktail napkin, while wearing pajamas. Charlie swallowed hard. She kept her eyes locked on his, refusing to look down. It wasn't military grade, Mr. Parker. It was a modified Visionaire cipher. The creator was arrogant. They used a repeating key and relied on secondary Cyrillic shifts to mask the frequency. Once you identify the key length, the mathematics are elementary. Duran stared at her. The utter incongruity of the situation was staggering. The girl who had silently poured his coffee for half a year, who he had never looked at twice, was speaking about cryptography with the casual authority of a university professor. "Who do you work for, Charlie?" Durand asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Are you FBI? Are you working for Volkov?" "I work for you, Mr. Parker. I clean the floors." Durand stepped closer, his physical presence overwhelming. "Cleaners do not crack syndicate ciphers. If you lie to me right now, I will have Darren take you for a very long drive. Tell me the truth. Who are you?" The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Charlie knew this was the precipice. She had to jump. "My father was Arthur Dawson," Charlie said, her voice finally trembling slightly. "He owed the Chicago outfit $500,000. He ran. They came for me. I was a doctoral candidate at Northwestern specializing in applied mathematics and cryptography. I abandoned my life to avoid being murdered over his debts. I came here because nobody looks for a brilliant mind holding a mop." Duran scrutinized her face. He looked for the lie, the subtle micro-expressions of deception. He found none. He only saw terror, exhaustion, and a fierce, undeniable intelligence burning behind her eyes. Slowly, the anger drained from Duran's posture, replaced by something much more dangerous: realization. He wasn't looking at a maid. He was looking at a weapon, an asset that had been hiding in plain sight. He turned his back to her, walking over to the crystal decanter on his desk. He poured 2 glasses of scotch, a gesture that sent a shockwave through Charlie. He turned back and offered her one. "Sit down, Charlie," Durand commanded softly. Charlie hesitated, then took the heavy crystal glass, sitting rigidly in the leather armchair opposite his desk. "Tomorrow night at OT 300 hours, my men are going to Pier 44, Durand said, leaning against the edge of his desk, his eyes never leaving hers. "We're going to reclaim what is mine, and we're going to send Nikolai Volkov a message written in the blood of his best men." He took a sip of his scotch. "But the war is just starting. They will change their codes. They will adapt. And when they do, I am not going to rely on Gregory." Durand reached out, taking the feather duster that was sticking out of the pocket of her cardigan. He tossed it carelessly into the trash can. "You're done cleaning floors, Charlie. As of tonight, you belong to me. You are my cipher." Morning arrived at the Parker estate, not with the gentle chirp of birds, but with the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a Bell 429 helicopter touching down on the south lawn. Charlie Dawson watched the spinning rotors from the window of a sprawling, silk-draped guest suite on the 3rd floor. 12 hours ago, she had been scrubbing baseboards in the scullery. Now she was standing on heated travertine floors wearing a tailored cashmere sweater and dark trousers that a terrifyingly efficient personal shopper named Francesca had delivered at dawn. Duran Parker did not believe in half measures. When he repurposed an asset, he elevated it to its maximum utility. Charlie was no longer invisible. She was the most guarded secret in the syndicate. The door to the suite clicked open. Darren Giordano stepped inside, his massive frame looking absurdly out of place against the delicate floral wallpaper. He held a sleek titanium-cased MacBook Pro and a stack of classified security dossiers. "Boss wants you in the new lab," Darren rumbled, setting the equipment on a glass coffee table. He looked at Charlie with a mixture of deep suspicion and grudging respect. In the underworld, Power was usually measured in muscle mass and caliber size. Dunn was still struggling to comprehend how a girl who weighed 120 pounds dripping wet had orchestrated a multi-million-dollar heist recovery with a ballpoint pen. "Where is Gregory?" Charlie asked, her voice steady, though her hands instinctively smoothed the pristine fabric of her new clothes. "Gregory is currently enjoying an extended, unpaid vacation at a very secure, very isolated cabin in the Adirondacks," Darren replied flatly. "He won't be touching a keyboard for a long time. The cyber division is yours now. Come on." Darren led her down to the sub-basement, past the wine cellar and the reinforced panic room, to a heavy steel door requiring retinal verification. Inside was a technological marvel that rivaled a national security agency outpost. Banks of liquid-cooled servers hummed behind soundproof glass. Multiple ultra-wide monitors displayed real-time tracking data, global shipping logistics, and dark web traffic nodes. Durand was already there, leaning over a central digital map table. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and faint, jagged scars. He looked up as Charlie entered. The air in the room instantly felt denser, charged with an electric tension that had nothing to do with the server rack. Pier 44 was a flawless victory, Durand stated, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "My strike team moved in exactly at 0300 hours. The Volkov men were entirely unprepared. We recovered the bearer bonds and intercepted enough C4 explosives to level a city block. Nikolai Volkov lost $30 million and 6 of his top lieutenants because of your napkin." Charlie walked slowly toward the map table, her analytical mind immediately cataloging the data streams on the screens. "He will know there was a leak. He won't assume his encryption was broken. The ego of a syndicate boss usually prevents them from admitting structural failure. He'll assume you have a rat in his organization." A sharp, genuine smile touched the corner of Durand's mouth. It was a terrifyingly handsome expression. Exactly. He spent the morning tearing apart his own inner circle. 2 of his capos were found floating in the East River an hour ago. "He's doing our work for us." Durand stepped closer, entering her personal space. Charlie forced herself not to step back. The scent of bergamot, leather, and gunpowder clung to him. "But paranoia breeds caution," Durand continued, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous baritone. "Nikolai has instituted a complete communications blackout. They've abandoned radio frequencies and standard cellular networks. My surveillance teams are blind. I need you to find them again." "Ow!" Charlie turned her attention to the monitors. The fear that had kept her paralyzed for 6 months was slowly being replaced by the intoxicating thrill of the puzzle. This was what she was born to do. "Standard surveillance won't work," Charlie murmured, her fingers hovering over a mechanical keyboard. "If they are using heavily encrypted mesh networks or localized Tor nodes, packet sniffing is useless. We need to look for the absence of data, not the data itself." "Explain," Durand ordered, leaning heavily on the table next to her. "When a massive criminal enterprise suddenly goes dark, they leave a negative footprint. A vacuum." Charlie typed a rapid sequence of commands, bypassing the standard operating system and dropping directly into a command line interface. "We map the historical data traffic of known Volkov shell companies, the import-export fronts in Brighton Beach, the real estate holdings in Brooklyn. I'll write a Python script to cross-reference the sudden drops in broadband usage with localized spikes in encrypted short-wave burst transmissions. We aren't looking for their words. We are looking for their shadows." Durand watched her hands fly across the keys. The raw, unfiltered intelligence radiating from her was magnetic. He had spent his entire life surrounded by men who solved problems with brass knuckles and intimidation. Watching Charlie dismantle an enemy empire with lines of code was like watching a master artist paint. "Do it," Durand commanded softly. "Whatever resources you need, they are yours. You answer only to me." For the next 72 hours, the sub-basement became Charlie's entire world. She barely slept, sustained by a steady stream of black coffee and the adrenaline of the hunt. She utilized advanced traffic analysis algorithms, exploiting vulnerabilities in the commercial Cisco routers the Volkov fronts used. By the third night, she found the thread. "They aren't using digital text at all," Charlie announced into the intercom, her voice hoarse. 10 minutes later, Durand strode into the lab, a tailored suit jacket slung over his shoulder. "What did you find?" Charlie pointed to a screen displaying a series of high-resolution digital photographs. They were pictures of mundane street scenes, uploaded to an obscure public image hosting forum popular with amateur photographers in Eastern Europe. "Steganography," Charlie said, her eyes burning with exhaustion and triumph. "It's the practice of concealing a file, message or image within another file. Nikolai's network isn't dark. It's hiding in plain sight. They are slightly altering the hex code of the least significant bits of the image pixels. To the naked eye, it's a picture of a coffee shop in Warsaw. To a decryption algorithm, it's it's a detailed blueprint of the Parker supply lines." Durand stared at the screen, then looked down at Charlie. The dark circles under her eyes only seemed to emphasize the fierce, unyielding light within them. "Can you extract it?" "I already did," Charlie said, hitting the enter key. The image of the coffee shop dissolved, replaced by a stark, terrifying list of coordinates and names. Durand's breath hitched. It was a hit list. And at the very top, written in clear, chilling text, was a specific target: the handler. "Identify and eliminate the Parker cryptographer." Silence descended upon the underground lab, heavy and suffocating. Charlie stared at the decrypted hit list, the blood slowly draining from her face. She had spent the last week playing a digital game of chess, treating the Volkov syndicate as abstract variables in a mathematical equation. The stark reality of the words on the screen violently dragged her back to the physical world. Identify and eliminate the Parker cryptographer. She wasn't just a ghost in the machine anymore. She was the primary target of a brutal Russian Mafia war. Durand moved instantly. The cold, calculating syndicate boss vanished, replaced by a predator assessing a lethal threat. He slammed his hand onto a red panic button beneath the desk. "Darren, full lockdown," Durand barked into the secure comms line. "Tier 1 security protocols. Nobody enters or exits the estate. Pull the perimeter guards back to the inner walls and arm the automated defenses." "Boss, what's happening?" Darren's voice crackled back, tight with adrenaline. "Volkov knows we have an asset breaking his codes. He doesn't know who she is yet, but he's hunting her." Durand severed the connection and turned to Charlie. She was gripping the edge of the desk so tightly her knuckles were white. Her breath was coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The repressed trauma of fleeing Chicago, the terrifying men who had ransacked her father's apartment, all of it came rushing back in a tidal wave of panic. "Hey," Durand said. It was the softest she had ever heard his voice. He closed the distance between them, his hands grasping her shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding her in the present moment. "Look at me." Charlie dragged her eyes up to meet his. The dark depths of his gaze were completely steady, radiating an absolute, unshakable control. "Nobody touches you, Charlie," Durand swore, the vow echoing in the quiet hum of the server room. "You are not a liability. You are the most valuable person in this house. The outfit in Chicago couldn't find you, and Nikolai Volkov will bleed out in the gutter before he gets within a mile of you. Do you understand me?" Charlie gave a small, jerky nod. The sheer force of his conviction was an anchor in the storm of her rising panic. Good. Durand released her shoulders but didn't step back, his proximity serving as a physical shield. Now we use this. If they are using steganography to broadcast their hit list, we can use it to feed them a virus. Charlie's mind, desperately seeking a problem to solve to stave off the fear, latched onto the tactical shift. A reverse payload. I can craft a Trojan. We encode it into an image file that mimics their exact digital signature. We drop it onto the forum using one of their spoofed IP addresses. When their central server downloads the image to extract the hidden text, the payload executes. What will it do? Durand asked, his eyes gleaming with dark anticipation. It won't just crash their servers, Charlie said, her voice gaining strength, the mathematician replacing the frightened girl. It will act as a digital parasite. It will map their entire offshore banking infrastructure, bypass the AES-256 encryption on their financial ledgers, and mirror all the data back to us before burning their hard drives to slag. Durand stared at her, genuinely awestruck. He had spent his life waging war with bullets, arson, and extortion. Charlie was proposing a surgical strike that would completely bankrupt a rival empire without firing a single shot. How long? Durand asked. To write a custom, undetectable polymorphic worm that can bypass military-grade firewalls. Charlie chewed her lower lip, running the calculations in her head. 36 hours, uninterrupted. You have 48, Durand said. Darren will sleep outside this door. I will handle the physical perimeter. The next 2 days blurred into a grueling marathon of code and caffeine. Charlie lived in a state of hyper-focus, constructing the digital weapon line by agonizing line. Durand became a constant looming presence in the lab. He brought her meals, himself plates of handmade pasta and grilled sea bass that Beatrice had prepared with trembling hands, terrified of the boss acting as a delivery boy. The dynamic between them shifted subtly in the enclosed high-pressure environment. The strict boundaries between syndicate boss and employee blurred. In the quiet, exhausted hours of the early morning, when the screens cast long shadows across the room, they talked. Not about codes or turf wars, but about the pieces of themselves they had buried. Why did you stay? Durand asked quietly on the second night. He was sitting on a leather sofa in the corner, nursing a glass of scotch, watching her code. When you broke the first cipher on the napkin, you could have left it anonymously and slipped away into the night. You chose to stay and translate it. Charlie paused her typing. She looked at the glowing green lines of the payload script. Because I couldn't stand the chaos. A cipher is just an arrogant attempt to hide order. My brain sees a puzzle, and it demands to fix it. Leaving that screen unsolved felt like leaving a bone broken. She turned to look at him, her defenses lowered by profound exhaustion. Why did you build all of this, Durand? The fortress, the guards. You run this empire like a military general, not a gangster. Because my father was a gangster, Durand replied, his voice devoid of warmth. He relied on fear, loyalty, and tradition got him poisoned at a steakhouse in Manhattan. I realized then that emotion is a vulnerability, flesh is weak. Systems, protocols, architecture, these are things you can control. He looked at her, his dark eyes intensely focused. Until you walked in and dismantled my $2 million system with a piece of paper. The air between them crackled, thick with unspoken implications. He was a man who demanded absolute control, and she was the variable he could never predict. The payload is ready, Charlie said softly, breaking the tension. Durand stood up, walking over to the terminal. Deploy it. Charlie initiated the sequence. She watched as the disguised image file a picture of a rusted anchor was injected into the Eastern European forum. They waited in agonizing silence. 5 minutes. 10. Suddenly, the secondary monitor exploded with cascading lines of raw data. Bank routing numbers, offshore shell company registrations, massive cryptocurrency wallet keys. The Trojan had breached the Volkov mainframe. "We have them," Charlie whispered, her hands shaking as she routed the incoming data to secure, encrypted cold storage drives. "Durand, I'm pulling their entire financial ledger. We own them." Before Durand could respond, the primary security monitor above the desk flashed a violent, pulsing crimson. A harsh, electronic siren pierced the silence of the lab. "Breach." The automated voice of the estate's AI system echoed through the intercom. "Warning, perimeter breach. Sector forward. Eastern wall compromised. Multiple armed hostiles detected." Durand's head snapped toward the door. The Volkovs hadn't waited for the hit list to be executed. They had brought the war to the front gates. Panic is a luxury neither of them could afford. The blaring siren in the sub-basement was deafening, a mechanical scream that shattered the fragile, quiet intimacy of the previous hour. On the primary security monitor, the schematic of the Parker estate flashed a violent, pulsing crimson along the eastern perimeter. Durand moved with terrifying precision. The quiet, contemplative man vanished, instantly replaced by the ruthless syndicate boss who had survived a dozen assassination attempts. He lunged toward a concealed biometric safe embedded in the concrete wall behind the server racks. The heavy steel door hissed open, revealing a tactical armory. "Stay in the chair, Charlie," Durand ordered, his voice a sharp whip crack over the wailing alarm. He pulled a customized Sig Sauer MCX assault rifle from the rack, slamming a magazine into the receiver with a sharp, metallic clack. "Do not stop the download. If we lose connection now, the Trojan will alert their sysadmins before the burn protocol executes." Charlie forced her eyes away from the terrifying flashing lights on the security feed and locked them onto her terminal. The data transfer progress bar hovered agonizingly at 62%. The numbers were scrolling fast, representing billions of dollars in illicit funds, but it felt like watching a glacier move. "Boss, they hit the main gate with a breached fuel tanker." Darren's voice roared through the intercom, underscored by the unmistakable, rhythmic popping of heavy automatic gunfire. It was a distraction. The main force came over the eastern seawall. They're using thermal cloaks and breaching charges. "This isn't Brighton Beach muscle, Durand. These guys are moving like Tier 1 operators. Rogue private military." "Hold the grand foyer, Darren," Durand commanded, racking the bolt of his rifle. "Do not let them reach the basement stairwell. Lethal force authorized on all unverified targets." The floor beneath Charlie's feet trembled. A dull, concussive thud echoed through the reinforced concrete, dusting the sleek glass of the computer monitors with a fine layer of plaster from the ceiling. They had breached the first floor. 74%, Charlie called out, her voice remarkably steady despite the violent shaking of her hands. She was typing furiously, running a secondary script to ping the estate's internal rotors, artificially boosting the bandwidth allocated to her encrypted tunnel. She was pulling data directly from Volkov's Cayman Islands offshore accounts, bypassing layers of Rothschild banking protocols with the digital equivalent of a sledgehammer. Durand stepped directly behind her chair, positioning his broad body between Charlie and the heavy steel blast doors of the lab. He raised his rifle, aiming directly at the reinforced threshold. "How much longer?" 3 minutes, Charlie gasped. "Their firewall is fighting back. A sysadmin in Moscow just noticed the bandwidth drain. I'm actively fighting them for control of the node." "Win," Durand said simply. It wasn't an encouragement. It was an absolute command. The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots echoed down the concrete corridor outside the lab. The fighting had spilled into the sub-basement. Through the thick steel door, Charlie could hear muffled shouting in harsh, staccato Russian, followed by the terrifying whine of a high-powered plasma-cutting torch igniting. Sparks began to shower from the edge of the doorframe. The Volkov kill squad had reached them. 88%. Charlie's fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, her mind compartmentalizing the terror. She wasn't in a bunker under siege. She was in a digital arena, wrestling with an invisible opponent miles away. She executed a localized denial-of-service attack on the Moscow sysadmin's IP, flooding their terminal with garbage data to buy herself 90 seconds of uninterrupted access. The sparks at the door turned into a blinding, molten orange line. The steel was giving way. "Almost there, Charlie," Durand murmured, his voice calm, his breathing slow and measured. He didn't flinch as a chunk of glowing metal hit the floor. 95. The heavy locking mechanism of the blast door groaned, the metal warping under the extreme heat of the torch. 99. The door violently blew open, concussive force sending a shock wave through the room. Smoke and pulverized concrete filled the air. Two figures dressed in heavy black tactical gear breached the threshold, raising their weapons. Durand fired. The deafening roar of the MCX in the enclosed space was physically painful. He dropped the first mercenary with a flawless 3-round burst to the chest armor, then seamlessly pivoted, taking the second man down before he could even register the ambush. 100%, Charlie screamed over the ringing in her ears. She slammed her palm onto the enter key. Download complete. Executing the burn protocol. On the secondary monitor, a massive string of command lines flashed green. The Trojan payload detonated inside the Volkov mainframe. It didn't just delete files, it actively scrambled the hexadecimal structure of their solid-state drives, rendering any data recovery impossible. In less than 10 seconds, the financial heartbeat of the Volkov syndicate flatlined. "Charlie," Durand dropped the empty magazine, seamlessly loading a fresh one. "Find their commander, now." Charlie's hands shook violently, but she grabbed the mouse. She isolated the short-wave radio frequencies transmitting near the estate. She found an encrypted tactical channel bouncing off a cell tower in East Hampton. "I have their comms," Charlie said, her voice raw. "Patch me in. Unencrypted. Broadcast it to every headset in the building." Charlie hit a switch on the mixing console, turning Durand's headset microphone into a localized radio tower. Durand stepped over the bodies at the doorway, his eyes burning with dark, lethal authority. He spoke into the microphone, his voice echoing not just in the lab, but in the earpieces of every mercenary currently assaulting his home. "This is Durand Parker. To the men currently dying in my hallway, your employer, Nikolai Volkov, is bankrupt. As of 30 seconds ago, his offshore accounts in the Caymans, his Swiss safety deposits, and his shell companies in Cyprus have been completely drained." The gunfire echoing from upstairs abruptly ceased. A heavy, confusing silence fell over the estate. Mercenaries fought for money, not loyalty. "Check your encrypted pay portals," Durand continued, his voice a smooth, deadly purr. "The escrow accounts holding your operational fees are empty. You are fighting a war for a ghost. Lower your weapons, walk out the front gates, and you get to live. Take one more step into my house and you will die for a man who cannot even afford your funeral." The silence that followed was thicker than the cordite smoke hanging in the air. For 60 agonizing seconds, the fate of the Parker Empire balanced on a razor's edge. Charlie held her breath, staring at the audio waveform monitor. Then the tactical channel crackled to life. A rough voice with a heavy South African accent spoke, confirming zero balance on the primary and secondary escrow nodes. "The contract is void. Fall back. All units, break contact and evacuate." The tense, coiled energy in the sub-basement slowly began to dissipate. The sound of retreating footsteps echoed above them. The siege was broken. The mercenaries, realizing they had been left holding an empty bag, were abandoning the sinking ship. Durin's voice came over the intercom, breathless and rough. "Boss, boss, they're pulling out, loading into their armored transports and hauling us down the Montauk Highway. We held the line. Secure the perimeter, Durin. Lock down the wounded and get the cleanup crew on site," Durand replied, finally lowering his rifle. He engaged the safety and set the weapon down on the map table. He turned slowly to face Charlie. She was still sitting in the ergonomic chair, bathed in the pale blue light of the monitors. She looked exhausted, her hair plastered to her forehead with cold sweat, dust covering her shoulders. But as she looked up at him, the fear was gone. In its place was a fierce, undeniable triumph. She had just dismantled a global crime syndicate with a keyboard. Durand walked toward her, the adrenaline of the firefight bleeding away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of awe. He reached out, his calloused hands gently resting on the armrests of her chair, boxing her in. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "What did you do with the money, Charlie?" he asked softly. Charlie met his gaze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The proximity of him, the smell of gunpowder and expensive cologne, was intoxicating. "It's sitting in a newly established, deeply encrypted ghost wallet on the blockchain," Charlie replied, her voice barely a whisper. $3.2 billion. Only I have the private key." Durand stared at her, an unreadable expression crossing his sharp features. "You could disappear right now. You could walk out of here, buy an island, and never have to look over your shoulder again. You have the ultimate leverage." "I don't want an island," Charlie said, surprising herself with the absolute certainty in her voice. The life she had known in Chicago, the quiet, safe, predictable academic world, felt like a distant dream. She had tasted the fire, the intoxicating thrill of power and consequence. She didn't want to hide anymore. "What do you want, Charlie?" Durand's voice dropped an octave, a dangerous, thrilling vibration. "I want the debt cleared," Charlie said firmly. "My father's debt to the Chicago outfit. I want it erased, and I want a seat at the table. Not as a maid, not as an asset locked in a basement. As your pawn." A single father named. At revision, Hesem smiled spread across Durand's face. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, a genuine expression of profound respect, and something much deeper, something that made Charlie's breath catch in her throat. "The debt was cleared the moment you broke that first cipher," Durand said, reaching up to gently brush a streak of concrete dust from her cheek. His touch was shockingly gentle compared to the violence that had just surrounded them. "And as for the table, you don't just get a seat, Charlie. You built the table." He closed the remaining distance between them, pressing his lips to hers. The kiss was not desperate or hurried. It was a profound claiming, a sealing of a partnership forged in fire and code. Charlie responded instantly, wrapping her hands in the lapels of his ruined shirt, pulling him closer. The quiet sub-basement, surrounded by the hum of servers and the wreckage of a failed siege, became the center of their new empire. Unrind. 2 weeks later, the underworld landscape of the eastern seaboard had fundamentally shifted. Nikolai Volkov, bankrupt and stripped of his mercenary protection, had been quietly apprehended by federal agents acting on an anonymous, highly detailed dossier dropped directly onto the FBI director's encrypted server. The Volkov syndicate collapsed overnight, their territories instantly absorbed by the Parker family. The Parker estate had been repaired, the bullet holes patched and the scorch marks scrubbed away by a new domestic staff. In the war room, the grand mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine. Sitting at the head of the table was Durand Parker, impeccably dressed in a dark bespoke suit. Flanking him were his capos, Darren and Leo, both looking slightly nervous. The doors to the war room opened. Charlie Dawson walked in. She was no longer wearing a grey cotton uniform. She wore a tailored slate blue blazer and a silk blouse, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying confidence. She carried a sleek tablet instead of a silver serving tray. The men in the room immediately fell silent. They didn't look at her with dismissal anymore. They looked at her with a profound, healthy fear. They knew the rumors. They knew that the quiet girl who used to pour their espresso had brought a Russian warlord to his knees without breaking a sweat. Charlie walked the chair directly to Duran's right, the seat traditionally reserved for the underboss. Leo Rossi respectfully stood up, vacating the chair, and moved down the table. Charlie sat down, placing her tablet on the polished wood. She met Duran's gaze. There was a shared, secret electricity passing between them, an unbreakable bond forged in the darkest corners of the digital and physical world. "All right," Charlie said, her voice calm and authoritative, echoing in the quiet room. She pulled out the heavily encrypted map of the Chicago logistics network. "Let's talk about the outfit. They have a vulnerability in their southern shipping routes. I found the cipher." Durand leaned back in his chair, a dark, satisfied smile playing on his lips. The game had changed and the king had found his queen. Thank you so much for watching the thrilling conclusion of this Mafia romance saga. If Charlie and Duran's epic transition from enemies to unstoppable partners kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow romance drama lovers and subscribe to the channel for more intense, pulse-pounding original stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below what was your favorite twist in the story. See you in the next one.